Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of a brand new podcast, The Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I am your host, your groove guru, your guide to the vibes, the cultural DJ. And yeah, this being a new podcast, some of you listening may be aware that I do indeed have a publication out, a zine called The Listening Room, but I wanted to create something that was a bit more public facing. So I thought a podcast was a good way to do that. I know everybody has a podcast now, but I figured why not? So here we are with Sonic Journeys. It's a bit of an extension of the zine, so we're going to not beat around the bush. We'll get right into it. This first episode of Sonic Journeys is talking about Sly Stone and Prince. Prince has often been compared to Sly Stone. Sly Stone has been regarded as kind of a proto-Prince. So on this first episode, we're going to break down some of the similarities, some of the differences between the two, how they changed the course of music culture and music history, and where their legacies left them off at. So the idea of Prince, a guy that played most instruments on his own records, didn't exactly pop out of nowhere. If you go back about 15 years prior to Prince, you'll see that Sly Stone was doing a lot of the same things, but how much? The question is how much of Sly Stone was actually in Prince, and if you look at a lot of the elements between them, you'll see that there's quite a lot. So for example, the genre blending, Sly Stone was taking the then burgeoning scene of psychedelia and adding it to soul music to essentially invent psychedelic soul. And then he went on to create funk. And I know there's a lot of debate between who invented funk between James Brown and Sly Stone, but for my money, it was indeed Sly Stone. He really laid the book down on what funk culture would become before artists like George Clinton and Parliament came along. A lot of the music, the style, the aesthetic, all of it was laid down by Sly Stone first, so I give that to him. One thing about his band, the Family Stone, is that it was both racially integrated and gender mixed, which in the early to mid 60s was something completely different. A lot of bands back then were either all white or all black, and a lot of them didn't have any women in them at all. So the fact that he had members that were black, white, and women was completely new and very forward thinking. But the bread and butter of this whole discussion is the fact that Sly Stone was a one-man band for much of the latter years of the Family Stone, where it really wasn't so much the Family Stone, it was mostly him. A lot of the earlier records, he was, playing organ and keyboards, but he was a very multi-talented musician. He came up in the church, he went to school for music, so he had the church vernacular with the technical know-how, and through that, he would play organ, keyboards, guitar, bass, drums, and you see this on records like Fresh and There's a Riot Going On, where he plays essentially all the instruments himself. He would bring in members from the band to do certain parts like horns and such or vocals, but essentially everything was done by him. At this point in time, he was isolating a lot of his friends and family and even bandmates, and he had a desire to create the music that he wanted to hear specifically, and that also leads into him being a studio wizard and fiddling around with a lot of different sounds and production methods that would become vital and crucial to the sound of the Family Stone from the late 60s and out through the early to mid 70s. You see on records like There's a Riot Going On, where the sound is very clustered and claustrophobic, and that's purely by design. A lot of the tracks on the songs were layered on top of each other, so that makes it feel really, really weighty. And speaking of weighty, he was also an early adopter of the drum machine, of which, of course, at that point in time was very primitive. These early drum machines. But what he would do that was, pretty different, was he would program drum patterns with the drum machine, and then play live drums over top of them to give them a lot of weight and earthiness. It is worth noting, though, that at that point in time, the usage of a drum machine was kind of frowned upon. Artists were championing the live aspect of playing instruments, and that included drums especially. But the fact that he was using a drum machine he kind of got a side eye from a lot of artists and musicians for doing something that for them felt like replacing the talent, So, yeah, he was an early adopter of drum machines and synthetic instruments as well. So how does that all relate to Prince? Well, Prince's brand of funk was very different from the Family Stones, who was more known for their gospel-influenced sound and the very earthy tone, while Prince's was way more polished, futuristic sounding, and often incorporated elements of new wave music from the late 70s and early 80s. Not only that, but he also incorporated elements of psychedelia, but in a different manner than the Family Stone did. The Family Stone came up during the era where psychedelia and the hippie movement was in full swing, but Prince did not subscribe to the hippie movement or their mannerisms or ways of living, but he did have an appreciation for the textures and the sounds that were incorporated during that movement. And you hear on albums like Around the World in a Day, where he has those types of vivid, colorful sounds that were common during the mid to late 60s, but in the early to mid 80s, right? Another thing that kind of adds to their relation between Prince and Sly Stone is that he also had a very diverse band. In fact, he had several very diverse bands. His first being the Family Stone, the Revolution. The Revolution was a band that, much like the Family Stone, was both racially integrated and gender mixed. You had members that were black, that were white, and were women. And this is important because it really shows the lineage between Sly and the Family Stone and Prince. He would go on to have bands like the New Power Generation, which was an even bigger band and even more diverse than the Revolution was. And of course, his final band before passing was Third Eye Girl, which was all women. So, there's that. And of course, like I said before, the bread and butter of this conversation is the fact that both were essentially one-man bands. However, the thing about Prince is that unlike Sly Stone, who started out more collaboratively with his group and then moving on to being more of a one-man band, is that Prince started out as a one-man band. That's kind of his claim to fame, especially early on. He had this, 18, 19-year-old kid who was playing 20 some odd instruments on an entire album. That was what made him so notable and popular at the onset of his career. And then as time went on, he would work towards being more collaborative with members of bands and not handling like every single thing on his own. Of course, he was still at the helm of production and instrumentation, still playing a great deal of instruments on his records in the 80s and the early 90s and so on. But he had members of the Revolution, of the New Power Generation, and of course of Third Eye Girl that were doing a lot of the heavy lifting with him, and it wasn't him playing every single thing on the records, right? And along with that, he was a studio mastermind. He was the captain of his ship, and he made sure that everything on his record sounded exactly the way that he wanted him to sound. He was very meticulous and worked tirelessly to make sure that that is what happened. Now, early on his first record, For You, he did have a co-producer who was supposed to essentially be the producer of the record, Tommy Vicari, who worked with Gino Vanelli, but Prince went out of his way to veto every single piece of advice and every single plan that Tommy had that did not align with Prince's wishes. So Prince was more or less the producer of that record. He had a producer with him, but it was almost like he wasn't there. He vetoed everything, essentially. So Prince, from then on, was the main producer, the head honcho for every single album that he put out, from then until his death. He was also a prominent user of drum machines and synthetic instruments. He was notable for popularizing the use of the Linn drum machine, which was kind of the big drum machine of that era of the 80s. So you hear that kind of blocky, that kind of weighty, snappy drum sound on a lot of his early records. That was the Linn drum. And that was his main squeeze as far as drum machines were concerned. Of course, he still played drums. He was very multi-talented, played drums, keyboards, guitars, bass, all of that. But he was known for wanting his music to sound very futuristic and forward-thinking and just new. That's kind of what he was shooting for with every single record, is kind of taking older sounds that he grew up with and was influenced and inspired by, but making it sound new. He didn't want to make anything that sounded dated or archaic or anything like that. He wanted everything to sound fresh. He wanted to sound polished. He wanted to sound like it was the future. So that was what he was working with at that point in time. So it's through all these points that we get a clear picture of how Sly Stone and Prince were linked, through things like them both being multi-instrumentalists who had a penchant for playing nearly every instrument on their records, to their early adoption of new technology in music like drum machines and synthesizers and different keyboards and such. And then also worth noting is their forward-thinkingness in political and social expression through their music. For example, Everyday People by Sly and the Family Stone asserted that no matter how different we are, we're all still the same. You can be black, you can be white, you can be from any background, culture, race, whatever. We are still all one people. And of course, this was the height of the civil rights movement, so there was a great deal of pro-black idealism in their music. And the more that Sly Stone associated himself with the Black Panthers, his music became more militant and way more Black Power-esque. So there's kind of that transition from jovial dance music to more civil rights focused music to just straight up pro-black, Black Power militantism in his music. Compare that to something like Sign of the Times by Prince, a song that touches on the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the crack epidemic, the threat of nuclear war, the Challenger explosion, all these different things. And you see kind of a parallel between the two eras, the 60s and the 80s, how there are some elements that are different, but in a way still the same. And both Sly Stone and Prince made it a point to use their musical platform to push these social, cultural, and political issues in their music. Another clear-cut parallel between the two is how they dressed and their stage mannerisms. Both had a tendency to dress very flashy and androgynous, which really set a bar for how pop stars would dress at both of their respective times. And then, of course, their stage mannerisms. Prince would meticulously rehearse these intricate dance numbers with him and his crew. Sly Stone had a tendency to get up from his organ, to dance around the stage, to invite people up to dance with him. And, through all these different facets, you can really see how Sly Stone influenced Prince in a very profound way. So in the midst of all of this, where does that leave their individual legacies? Well, Sly Stone was an early revolutionary, and that can't be refuted. But due to a great deal of personal struggle later in his life, his star waned a bit earlier than he probably would have liked for it to. He had a tendency to miss dates, to show up late, and then his drug habit kept him from being at the top of his game, to the point where he went from being one of the biggest stars in the country to kind of becoming a parody of himself, unfortunately. Despite this, of course, he was still majorly influential to many soul and funk bands to come, but he really couldn't be there with them because of his habits and the way that his life was kind of turning out. Compare that to Prince, who started out gaining a bit of popularity to eventually becoming a global megastar and then just continuing to become an even bigger star over time. His star never exactly waned. He had fluctuations in popularity throughout the decades, especially throughout, the 90s and early 2000s. But in essence, Prince never stopped being at the top of his game. His stardom and his popularity maintained throughout the course of his career, even into his dying day. He was still one of the biggest stars in music and in the world as a whole. Now, this is not me saying that Prince is better than Sly Stone or that Sly Stone is any less than Prince just because of how their individual careers panned out. Prince would be the first to tell you that Sly Stone was the greatest. They were both legendary black pop auteurs, but it's through looking at how their careers panned out that we can see that Prince essentially picked up where Sly Stone left off and perfected what it was that Sly Stone invented. With all that being said, this concludes the first episode of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. Thank you all so much for listening. In addition to this episode, there will also be an accompanying playlist of songs curated by yours truly that will feature tracks from both Sly and the Family Stone and Prince that will further illustrate the parallels between the two of them. Be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to check out the socials. Links for those will be in the description. And yeah, that is everything. Thank you all so much for listening again. This is the Cultural DJ, signing off.